I'm Josh, I'm an investment researcher and a qualified actuary, and this is why Dopamine Detox is a cheat code to success. So dopamine detox is a cheat code to success because it makes your work more pleasurable. So dopamine is a pleasure chemical in the brain, and we stimulate dopamine by finding rewards. However, as Loretta Breuning states in her book I, Mammal, the quest for dopamine often sends people into self-destructive patterns. And that's because the world has a lot of cheap dopamine out there. Think drugs, alcohol, social media, video games, junk food. All of that stimulates dopamine in a very acute way, i.e. it's a very strong and quick response. So lots of people gravitate towards that sort of dopamine. Whereas the dopamine you get from, pursuing long-term rewards is much more subtle and a much harder dopamine to get. The other problem is that we don't have an infinite supply of dopamine to focus on the big rewards and also these cheap dopamines. Now, dopamine feels so good, we want it all the time. The problem is that dopamine didn't evolve to give us pleasure all the time. It evolved to give us a little bit of energy when we can see a reward on the horizon to help us get that reward. And the way it works is it builds up a reserve, and then that reserve gets released when we can see a reward in sight, and it makes us pursue that reward. So if we're going around all day going for cheap dopamine, i.e. we're scrolling on our phones, we're eating junk food, we're having alcohol, we're spending all of those dopamine reserves on that short-term dopamine, which is really acute and really satisfying in the short term, which means we have less to spend on the longer term rewards that we also need dopamine for. So the cheat code to success is to save your dopamine for those longer term rewards and don't spend it on the cheap forms. And by cutting out all of the cheap forms of dopamine, i.e. dopamine detox, it will mean that the more subtle forms of attaining dopamine by chasing those longer term rewards is much more satisfying to you. If you focus on continuously trying to get more and more dopamine out of the system and don't allow for this replenishing time and this lack of dopamine in the system, what normally happens is you end up going down a very destructive path. You'll probably end up chasing this cheap dopamine because it's the most stimulating, and this can lead to quite addictive behavior. So it's probably what you see with alcoholics, gambling addicts. They're constantly chasing this cheap dopamine because it's so potent, and because their baseline has been adapted to that high level, they need even more to get that same dopamine hit, which drives them down this kind of destructive pathway. This ironically leads to pain. So the infinite pursuit of pleasure by continuously pushing harder on that dopamine lever means that you end up being an addict, and that ultimately causes you a lot of pain and an inability to get any pleasure out of that additional effort. In his book, The Molecule of More, Daniel Lieberman states that from dopamine's point of view, having things is uninteresting. It's only getting things that matters. So every time you achieve a certain reward, your baseline gets raised and you become to expect that reward. And that's why you need to be constantly pushing for more and more rewards, or bigger and bigger rewards. So you can't get more dopamine without the constant pursuit of more. I've definitely been here where I haven't really taken into account my body's kind of natural ebb and flow and need for rest, and I've constantly been pushing at that top end. And what I definitely found was that the system pushes back even harder, and it ends up essentially causing some sort of burnout or the system to break. I think I was definitely part of this kind of always on culture where we worked hard, play hard, and it was kind of glorified that we would, be the last ones out in the evening and the first ones back in the office, and that didn't allow for this kind of natural cycle of rest. So ultimately that led to burnout and just not productive outcomes, I'd say. I think it also comes from this idea of the body as kind of a machine that you can just keep going at a constant level the whole time, and not that the body is actually a biological system and has this kind of natural kind of pulse or ebb and flow or go and off. And I think lots of people still haven't realized that about their body. I remember when I started running, I was like, I'm just going to run every day, I don't need a rest day. And I definitely appreciate this kind of need for rest, or I thought that it wasn't necessary, or I thought it was a form of weakness. So if you keep trying to chase more and more all the time, the system eventually breaks. So the solution to this is a dopamine detox, and it's a cheat code to success because it will make your work more pleasurable. So dopamine detox naturally resets your baseline lower, meaning that normal tasks become way more pleasurable, like your work. By setting your baseline lower, it means that a normal task will release a large amount of dopamine, whereas if your baseline is super high, you might need some really potent stimulus to get you above that, to get you that same amount of dopamine. So by removing all the cheap dopamine, it naturally sets your baseline lower, so the really meaningful tasks and activities that lead to your long-term success are actually way more pleasurable to you. And I think it's interesting talking to people about this, because you speak to people about, I really enjoy work or walking or meditation, and I think people that have like a high dopamine baseline are like, oh my god, that's so boring, like I need all that stimulation and I can't just like sit still or meditate for 20 minutes. And that's just a clear sign of their dopamine baseline being too high. So yeah, you have to put a bit of work to bring your baseline down, and yeah, maybe that can be slightly painful in the short term, but once you're there, it's actually really satisfying getting like a huge amount of pleasure from these basic activities. Yes, it's not as potent as some of the kind of cheap dopamine, but yeah, it's definitely very pleasurable. So how might you go about a dopamine detox? Well, I would turn off all your notifications from your phone. I would remove processed foods from my diet. I would not watch TV. I would read. I would not go on social media. I would meditate as well. So they're all different things that you can do to help bring your dopamine baseline down. And that means that when you go to do a normal thing, like, do your work or read a book, focus on something that's a bit less stimulating, that stuff is all just super enjoyable because you brought your baseline down so low. And that is why dopamine detoxing is a cheat code to success. It makes you love your work. As Anna Lembek states in her book, Recovery Starts with Abstinence. I would say that this is actually a fantastic book on dopamine and how you can, I guess, manage your dopamine system. It basically starts from the perspective of a, addict, so someone that's got a very broken dopamine system, but there are obviously lessons to take away for all of us. So an even bigger cheat code than dopamine detox for success is what I'm going to call a dopamine reversal. So in Anna Lembek's book, she talks about how the dopamine system is essentially a balance between pleasure and pain. Most of the time, we keep trying to press on the pleasure side to get more pleasure, but as we've seen, that leads to kind of decreased marginal returns and also the potential for you to go down this kind of cheap dopamine route where you get way more stimulating dopamine and stuff that doesn't necessarily contribute towards your success. We spoke about dopamine detox, which I would say is kind of balancing out that scale. So you've got kind of balance between pleasure and pain because you've removed a lot of the kind of toxic pleasurable things that are weighing you down. But the other thing to do is actually to press on the pain side. So I'm going to call it mild discomfort because I think it is, we don't want to go too far into the pain side because that can become actually quite damaging as well. But by pressing on the pain side, this even further decreases your baseline, and quite often your body overreacts to this kind of stimulus. Nassim Taleb talks about this in his book Anti-Fragile, where he states that if humans fight the last war, nature fights the next one. The body typically overshoots in response to an exposure and over-prepares. So he's talking about this specifically with regard to strength training, but I think it's true of dopamine as well. So you find if you press on the pain side, your body tends to overreact and create loads of dopamine, which I think is used to get you out the hole that you've put yourself into and then also pursue that reward that you're looking for in the first place. So you end up with more dopamine in the system if you push on the pain side. Examples of where people do this: ice baths. In Anna Lembek's book, she talks about ice baths giving you a 250% increase over baseline in terms of dopamine and norepinephrine, which is basically like adrenaline, I think. So by pushing on that pain side, you get a natural kind of massive dopamine boost. Other things you can do, I think people like kind of intuitively know this, but exercise, quite painful, quite uncomfortable, but when it's over, you tend to get a massive boost of dopamine. One of my mates, he's a keen marathon runner, and he just notices how everything kind of improves around his life when he does marathon training because he gets that kind of increased dopamine. One of the things I've been doing, which I speak about in my other videos, is fasting. So obviously fasting is completely removing kind of dopamine from any food and kind of withdrawing yourself from that. And I find that when I'm fasted, I just have so much kind of get up and go. It's actually crazy. So yeah, lots of examples of the ways you can do this. So an even bigger cheat code I'm going to say is the kind of dopamine reversal or pressing on the discomfort side. Personally, I discovered this in lockdown. We're all trapped in our houses and it was winter and it was cold and wet and dark outside, but I used to go out on these massive cycles, get cold, wet and miserable, and I'll come home and I was so happy to be home, and that's my just like baseline. Whereas if I just stayed in the whole time, I think I would have been pretty miserable. So I decided to get a bit uncomfortable, and that made my day-to-day, i.e. my normal, seem really exciting and really great. I'm really thankful to be home. I then took that even further. I did a marathon, I did a high rocks competition, and I did a gravel ultra as well, so 300k across Scotland. And yeah, I definitely kind of got addicted to this idea of like pressing on the discomfort pain side because the boost afterwards was just so great. Obviously, Anna Lembek says in her book that it can be addictive to be overly addicted to that pain side, and she references a lot of extreme sports there. So yeah, gotta be careful, but I definitely think that is an even bigger hack than a dopamine detox. So yeah, there you go. That's one for free. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to hear more from me, don't forget to check out this one here. Thanks.